Hey everybody, this is John DeRelay with Wheelhouse, Head of Revenue Management Education. And today, as part of our Micro Market Magnifier series, we're going to talk about Okaloosa and Fort Walton on the Emerald Coast. So let's dive right in and take a look at what we've got going on. I did prep some data for you using the Wheelhouse Sets tool. If you cut our highlights, I used our market reports, which is the whole area, but I did decide it would be helpful to break some of this market up for us to take a little closer look. So we're going to look at three areas today. We're going to look at Okaloosa Island and Fort Walton Beach together. Again, my criteria here is properties that have mostly been commercialized and available for most of last year, and we're over 60% occupancy. We're going to look at just Okaloosa Island properties. And we're going to look at the Okaloosa Island and Fort Walton properties, but 3 bedrooms up. And in this one, I did include more properties. This is a much more restricted group. So I allowed any 3-bedroom that was available last year and was over 20% adjusted occupancy over the course of last year to be in the set. Okay, before we jump into the individual sets, I just want to take a look at a little bit about how the booking windows existed for a few different areas. The first one we're going to look at is spring, and this is going to be across the whole market. So you can see here I have a lot of stuff. So you can see there are bookings up in the Fort Walton City area. They're pretty minimal compared to the concentration down here. And this over here is showing the bookings over time for that March time period of 2024. And I think what's pretty interesting is if you've watched our last one on Destin, there's going to be some similar trends. Obviously, booking is pretty slow. We get quite a lot of booking initially around February, March of the previous year. That's the first kind of like very small step forward. Kind of interesting for us because we're entering that period. So just keep in mind that you may start to see next spring's bookings for really early booking kind of properties as early as spring this year. But really, I think the meat and potatoes of what we want to get to is where these booking windows really start as we get into the year. You can see the pace is very slowly building up through November and December. So I would call that not very much pace. Coming to around first week of January, maybe a little earlier, as much as like Christmas, you see this line is getting a little steeper. So we're seeing an increase in pace pretty much all the way through January. That's going to stay pretty steady until about the end of February, and then there's an even steeper kind of last minute. Now, I'm wondering if last year that steepness in the last minute window is really a factor of, I know a lot of people were holding rates. They were expecting demand to be a little higher, so we ended up selling a lot more. I would hope that this year we can kind of see a little earlier booking, but we're basically at the very beginning of that window where we should start to see some bookings on the books. Now, let's take a look at the summer situation as well. So I have the same animation available for summer. I've just got it at the end, so we're just going to take a look. Kind of looking at where the start of that window is, it's about the same time. So just like in Destin, people start booking for both spring and summer. The summer booking is going to be at a little lower rate, but it's going to be consistent for a much longer period of time. Now, I think what's pretty interesting about this compared to Destin, when we looked at Destin, there were a few spots where it was very clear that the summer booking starts to accelerate, both in January, in the spring, and then in April, May. In the Okaloosa, Fort Walton area, it seems to be much more consistent and constant throughout the entire season, or like up until that summer season. So just a reminder, we are looking at Memorial Day through the end of July for bookings that were stayed on. And when I look at this, I don't see a big increase. I see kind of a little bit of an increase here at the beginning of the year. So it does seem to start a little later than Destin. Stays pretty consistent. I see a slight change here at the end of February for summer where it starts to pick up speed a little. But other than that, it remains pretty consistent. Now, this is also interesting here. I know these are very slight, so it may be hard to see on your screen, but this gets steeper here, and then it kind of tapers off a little. So in mid-April, and this is looking to be about Easter time period, so it could just be because of Easter. That sales pace slowed down a little bit and then it picked back up, but it doesn't seem to pick up faster than it was picking up before. It seems to kind of just maintain its pace. And then unlike in the spring, where we see this line get steeper in the short window, you actually see this stay consistent and then taper off. So I think, when we look at summer, that does support that idea I was saying about spring, where people had a lot of inventory at the last minute. You see a lot of changes in rates. I'm obviously not showing you differences in ADR here, but my hunch here is that people were a little more prepared for summer. We obviously have a much longer, more steady booking window, so there's a lot less panic in the last minute to fill. So let's take a look at some occupancies in terms of what we can expect this year. So I have pulled up the adjusted occupancy for the entire Okaloosa Fort Walton area. This is going to be a mix of bedroom types, again, stuff that was over 60% occupied. And what I have here is January through December and both 2025's current occupancy on the books and where we were in 2024. And this one's a little bit more interesting than Destin in the sense that it seems to be a little bit more stable on the occupancy side. The lows aren't quite as low. The highs are still as high, but it also doesn't quite reach the same like full sellout. That could be because we're including some kind of disparate areas in this. It does look like the spring is a lot stronger. This early February higher occupancy period is really interesting. This is adjusted occupancy, so some of that could be blocks or that people allow their snowbirds to go further. But it does look a lot stronger than when we looked at Destin, and that's something to keep an eye on. Is our February going to look as strong in the market? Can we capture market share there? We still see the same peaks around the same dates on spring break and Easter. One thing to remember is this break from the 23rd through the 5th. Easter is not going to be over those dates this year, so we may see some lessening of compression since people for multiple events won't necessarily be coming on the same date range. Easter is going to be pretty late this year, over in April. We may see that these kind of, don't look as strong, or, the dates are going to be a little different. Like in Destin, I have some concerns about the snowbird season. I've been looking at a lot of these Emerald Coast markets, and the January on the books seems a lot lower than I would hope to see it. We know it's low season, so overall market occupancy is low. But when we look at these numbers, we're often less than half of what we booked last year, and we're in the month already, which means I would expect us to have a pretty weak January. If you haven't already made adjustments to your snowbird prices, I would do that. And I would already start thinking about what's going to happen next year, because if snowbirds are getting squeezed as a demographic in their consumer spending, this could be a kind of consistent problem. And right now there's just not different demand to replace it yet. Now it'll be really curious to see what happens as we get into week 2 and 3 of January. But already if we're looking at the first week of January, we're coming in pretty low here. And that's a concern for me, and I think should be a concern for everyone through January, and especially because this market maintains higher occupancies through February. That's something you really want to get ahead of if you're pacing behind for your snowbirds. Final piece I want to mention here, because this is pretty different than the Destin one we looked at previously, but April looked pretty strong here from an occupancy perspective. I wonder if that's because the target demographics for Fort Walton Beach and Okaloosa are a little different than Destin as a whole, but it looks like you guys really maintained a pretty strong occupancy in this area. I think that you guys can continue to maintain that advantage, but you may see a little bit more pressure and competition because, as I've talked to people who are in the core Destin and Santa Rosa areas and some of these other areas, Sandestin, Miramar, they're already planning to be a little bit more conservative for the spring than they have been last year. And any of that demand that was looking for a better deal, found better deals in Okaloosa or Fort Walton and kind of kept your occupancy high, you may have more competition this year than you did previous years. To just Okaloosa Island, I'm not going to hang here for too long because, frankly, I don't see really significant differences in the overall trends looking at this. It looks very similar to Okaloosa when you include Fort Walton. I do think the January maybe it looks a little weaker even than the Fort Walton area. Again, I think most people are going to see a lot of pressure on kind of mid-level drive to locations, but there has been some advantages to it because obviously if that is your primary and you're able to price in a way that makes it a good deal, you may be able to take stuff from places that are used to selling much higher and maybe haven't been reacting quite as quickly. Jumping over to the 3 bedrooms and above, I think the most interesting difference in trend here is, our summer looks pretty similar And this is, keep in mind, this is properties that were only booked 20% or more, and our overall occupancies are still looking really high. The peak dates are looking the same. The biggest difference here with these larger properties in this area is that advantage that existed in the spring and in the shoulder seasons is not as pronounced in the bigger properties. So that's just something to keep in mind. You really do want to pace ahead, especially if you were well occupied in these periods last year. I would expect there's much more competition from other areas around you for these larger properties, and you just don't see them reaching the same heights as, say, the whole market as a whole, where up over 60% in April. When we look at these larger properties, that drops down into the 50% range, which is a pretty big difference. So these are ones that we really want to look out for, be really cognizant about getting the heads in the beds, and making sure the rate is competitive, because, even though this product type is much smaller in this area, there's going to be a lot of this product type in other areas nearby that are going to be competing with you. I'm back on the whole Okaloosa Fort Walton side, and I just kind of want to drive home here this April time period. I think it's really unique because I've been looking at a lot of these Emerald Coast markets. I looked at Destin recently, and the occupancy being really strong here, I think, has been really helpful. Obviously, the RevPAR still looks like kind of a lower season, but the fact that occupancy could be driven in February and April, I think, is a huge strategic advantage. You really don't want to take your eyes off the ball there, and I think the key is, if you're pacing behind, get ahead of it, because obviously the product in this area can drive better occupancy performance than surrounding areas, but you really can't fall behind, because if you go to Destin or you go to Miramar or you go to Navarre or any of these other areas nearby, if they start dropping their rates, you may see that demand shift and not necessarily capture that same occupancy position, which the market was so successful in doing in 2024. Jumping over to here, I'm on the asking rate. So this is the rates that people are posting. And I think what's most interesting to this compared to, say, the Destin area is in Destin, the median and the average prices were very separated. So the average was much higher. There was a lot of really high-end stuff pricing in the market compared to the median. That means there was a big spread of rates in the marketplace, which frankly makes it quite hard to compete in that market. Prices are much tighter here. You can see that the median and the average are very close to each other. The range is still fairly large, but the fact that the median and the average are close to each other pretty much across the board, I think, is going to be really, really important for you guys. It means you have to be really cognizant of what your competitors are doing within your market. It means you want to watch for when you hear people in nearby kind of market areas talking about lowering rates, because there's going to be a lot of price sensitivity. And what I've been saying before is that, you don't want to be caught in a place where you're pacing behind and then suddenly you're trying to chase the window. Something else that I think is a good thing to flag at the market level is that April success in 2024 with the high occupancy compared to other market areas and even what you're doing. I think there's a little bit of a risk here. The rates are being held much higher over last year, or over this year, than where they were kind of ended up last year. And I think if you're seeing that start to pace down, you really need to review and see if your prices are in line with the average ADRs you are posting, so that you can really try to drive, especially if other markets or the nation itself is maybe expecting things to slip a little bit more than it did in 2024. Guys, well, if you want to investigate some of this data on your own, please feel free to log into Wheelhouse and experiment with our sets tool. All of the data I was showing you today is available there. And then check in with us as I look into other market areas, especially as we get a little further into January, and also potentially follow up on these and just see how things are coming together as we get deeper into Q1. Thank you.